Labas vakaras ir sveiki atvykę į Vilniaus universiteto komunikacijos fakultetą. Šiandien mūsų laukia ypatingas įvykis, nes fakultete svečiuojasi žymus rašytojas ir kuratorius Nicolas Bourriaud. Šitą progą aš iš karto persijungiu į anglų kalbą, nes mūsų svečias lietuviškai nekalba. So, welcome everyone to the Faculty of Communication at Vilnius University. Today is a very special day for us because we have a special guest coming to us from France. It's a very famous curator and writer, Nicolas Bourriaud, who will host a lecture for our students, and due to a high attention, high demand for the lecture is going to be broadcasted to the general public over the Facebook platforms. To begin with, I would like to introduce our guest and his illustrious career. Nicolas Bourriaud is currently a director of Montpellier Contemporain, MOCO, which is a new institution gathering the contemporary arts center La Panacée, the City Art School, and the colekcijų. The newly established institution is exclusively devoted to the presentation of contemporary art collections. Nicolas Bourriaud was also the director of École nationale supérieure des beaux-arts de Paris. This is a very prestigious French institution, French art school. He also worked for the Ministry of Culture of France, was Gulbenkian curator for contemporary art at Tate Britain in London, and he also founded and co-directed a very important contemporary art institution, which is a Palais de Tokyo, operating in Paris. Among other important works Nicolas Bourriaud has performed was the recent curatorship of Taipei Biennale and the Istanbul Biennale. Both biennales were exploring the impact of the Anthropocene upon the art. I also need to mention that Nicolas Bourriaud published several important theoretical essays, including world-famous relational aesthetics, post-production, radicant, and the X-form. It is a pleasure to announce that his latest book will come out of print in 2021, and the title is really intriguing. It's called Inclusions, Aesthetics of the Capitalist Scene. Well, hopefully the lecturer will touch upon these issues in the course of the lecture. So it's a great pleasure to host Nicolas Bourriaud at the Faculty of Communication of Vilnius University. And before we begin, I would like to say a special thanks to Institut Français Lituanie, who actually supported this guest lecture, and Kaunas 2022 organization, which took care of broadcasting and most and foremost put us in touch with Nicolas Bourriaud. So welcome to the Faculty of Communication, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Martinas. I'm very happy to be here with you, even if I would be happier if I would be physically in Lithuania, to be honest. But I hope I can come for the Kaunas Biennial next year, if everything's fine, because today we don't know. I'm actually going to try to make a link between relational aesthetics that you mentioned and my last book, just to show the connections between the two and show that it's not something else, it's a logical evolution, I would say. But maybe that could be the core of our conversation. What I'm trying to do through this book called Inclusions, Aesthetics of the Capital Scene, but also with the shows I curated recently, for example, the Taipei Biennial in 2014, or Crash Test, which was a show, an exhibition gathering younger artists in Montpellier, or the Istanbul Biennial last September, is to explore the new landscape, the new relational landscape actually we're living in a way. Because what has changed very deeply since I wrote this first book is actually the content of the word relationship, the content of our relational panorama. And it's more and more, and that's the purpose of the title, more and more inclusive. And in the recent years, and especially because of the impact on the global consciousness that the Anthropocene had, this inclusions, this new mentality that we're actually starting with today is, I think, deeply modifying our relationship to art, the way artists are thinking, seeing, and practicing. And that's what I want to talk about today. Of course, I'm starting from what is called the Anthropocene, which has been, as you may know, of course, the term was actually invented by Paul Crutzen in 2001. And it describes this new geological era, which is characterized by the impact of the human activities upon the planet. But this we know. So from this, which is not anecdotal, it's deeply modifying our vision of the world. In a way, the first thing is that it's an extension of the social, in a way. That's what I'm going to try to address today. There are four aspects that I want to discuss today of this the Capitalocene way, the Capitalocene era. I use the term Capitalocene instead of Anthropocene now, because I feel quite certain that it's not the human being, the human species as such, which is having this impact, this catastrophic impact on the planet. It's more a production system. It's an economical system. It's capitalism, mainly. It's the search for profit and the exploitation of natural resources, which actually created the situation we're in. So I prefer to use the term Capitalocene than Anthropocene, which is referring to anthropos, the human species. So the four elements of this new aesthetics are first, promiscuity, a new sense of promiscuity. I'm going to develop that later. And two, what I call the crisis of the human scale. And that's directly related to my new perspectives on relational aesthetics. Three, it's the crisis of the subject-object relationship. And four, it's what I call the molecular anthropology and the attention that artists are paying to the molecular dimension of the world today. So let's start with, I'm talking about anthropology. I just mentioned this notion. It's not by random. I think that anthropology and art are actually merging today because they follow the kind of parallel evolution, both of them, since the middle of the 20th century. There were actually many books and theories about it already. For example, Joseph Kossut in 1975 has written a very interesting text called The Artist as an Anthropologist. Al Foster in the 90s wrote about the artist as an ethnographer. But it was just the first two steps, I would say, on this direction. And the very important curator, Okwi and Vezor, in 2013, was it? I think it was 2013, curated this show in Paris called Intense Proximity, which actually was also a way to compare ethnography, ethnology, and contemporary art. So there are bases for this comparison. And when I talk about anthropology, I'm talking about contemporary anthropology. For example, someone I'm going to talk about later, Philippe Descola, who wrote Beyond Nature and Culture. It's a book written in 2005, which I think is absolutely seminal and a book that everyone should read, actually, because it's absolutely crucial to the current debates. And for example, one of the most important ideas in the book is is the fact that, for example, the Amazonian population that Philippe Descola has studied in the 70s, the Ashwa population, for them, animals are social partners. So he actually builds this idea of extension of the social circle to animals by the same way. We Western people, the Western thought is an exception into this vision of the world. That's what I want to address. French philosopher Patrice Maniglier, who's also very much interested into anthropology, considering the evolution of the anthropological discourse recently, used the term the geological turn. It's not the anthropological turn, it's the geological turn. Why? Because, I quote him, anthropology cannot simply be this knowledge which is produced on the basis of differences between us and others within humanity. Those differences must at once be apprehended as different ways of occupying the earth. That is to say, of being caught in the global ecological catastrophe. I think that's this sentence is very important because what we saw in the last 30 years in the evolution of anthropology is the extension of anthropology into non-human beings, and now even to molecular realities. And this is exactly what's going on in art today. And that's this parallel which is, I think, is determining in the way I see contemporary art. So we are caught, all of us, human beings and non-human beings, in the same catastrophic landscape. And artists are problematizing, to take the words of Patrice Maniglier, ways of occupying the earth. And there are many problematizations of this idea. Are the artists supposed to follow natural flows? Are they supposed to create a sustainable development, sustainable areas? Are they supposed to produce new objects or to recycle objects? Are they supposed to inquire? Are they supposed to analyze the materials and all the fabrics that the world is made of? Yeah, there are many choices, and at the moment it seems that contemporary art is at a crossroads in between all those different possibilities. I will here take maybe an image which I think is very important, which was at the core of the Istanbul Biennial that I curated last year, which is the image of the seventh continent. You know that we call nowadays seventh continent this huge mass of floating plastic within the oceans. Actually, it's as big as twice or no, more than twice, 6 times or 7 times France, for example. It's absolutely huge. It's literally a new land which has been created by our wastes, by our activities also. So we have a new continent, which is what's called the seventh continent, which is actually a way for me to make a loop with the colonialism, for example. What the colons called the New World, which is actually totally inhabited in the 15th century, and this seventh continent are creating kind of short circuit of the history of capitalism and the history of the Anthropocene, of the Capitalocene. The new continent, which is created by our plastic wastes, nobody can live there. It's not a continent that we want to inhabit. It's a continent which is a kind of a dark, the unconscious of our civilization in a way. We don't want to see it. We don't want to live there. So it's the exact opposite of what used to be called the New World for the first colonialistic powers. So I think that in this short circuit between the two, we have something which is very interesting to understand what's going on today. And in a way, it's also an image of a kind of anthropological task for the artists today. How could we understand the world we're living in if we don't inquire about this seventh continent, about this this land of plastic, this land of waste? It's in a way the symbol of the world we're living in, unfortunately, and it's not habitable. So it's the new subject matter par excellence of this kind of anthropological drive which feeds contemporary art today, at least on a symbolic level, of course. It's a continent which has been created, which is the consequence, the direct consequence of the ideology of progress and the myth of progress, which has actually driven also colonialism, and the mastering of the planet by the Western powers. And of course, consumption society, it goes without saying. What this new space that we call the seventh continent shows is also a new topology of the planet. We are also living for the first time in history into a totally finite world. We actually know every pixel of the planet now. There are no blank spaces anymore since the beginning of the 2000s. So this 21st century opens on a planet which is known in its integrality. And that's absolutely an event for me. It creates a new way of considering our world. So it goes along with one of the major consequences of the Anthropocene or Capitalocene, which is promiscuity. And this promiscuity has many facets, actually. We know now for sure that pangolin in China can modify deeply our everyday lives, right? We know also that the way what we buy actually for breakfast has an impact on the Malaysian forests. We are living in a world where everything is impacted by everything, where consequences are everywhere and visible. It was not necessarily the case in the past, because we didn't see the consequences. Now we can see them because we have this huge optical apparatus which surrounds the planet and which feeds us back with the image of our actions. So this is a completely new mentality that we actually have today. Anthropocene is like an echo chamber in a way. Everything resonates with everything, and obviously it creates a new vision of space, a new vision of space-time, which is, of course, integrated in the artist's way of seeing the world. And you have many examples of this kind of collapsed spaces, not only in installations, also in painting, by the way. But I could actually quote a few examples, but as I don't have images, so it's going to be a bit too dry if I start talking very precisely about this or this artwork. Just want you to keep in mind this idea of promiscuity, this idea that those new promiscuities are creating new foldings also. And those foldings have a consequence, which is that some points which were very far away before are very close now, and vice versa. There's a redistribution of the geography according to consequences, according to the effects of the Anthropocene. And there is someone, an art historian, who actually foresaw that, who had a clear idea 1 century ago of this disappearance of the distances. It's Aby Warburg, who's very well known now, even more than everything else, for the Atlas Mnemosyne, where you actually put together images following certain threads. Aby Warburg was one of the first art historians to visit, for example, the Hopi Indians at the end of 19th century. And from this trip, actually, where he observed the rituals of the snake, for example, which is one of the important pillars of the Hopi culture and the Navajos also. He came back with a kind of apocalyptical tone, actually. I quote Aby Warburg, "Telegraph and telephone are destroying the cosmos, but myth and symbols, in attempting to establish spiritual bonds between man and the outside world, create space for devotion and scope for reason, which are destroyed by the instantaneous electrical contact." It's interesting to see that it's coming from the beginning of 20th century, this sentence, but it could totally apply to the instant communication, goes faster than light today, that we are actually living in. It seems today that images are produced even before they are even seen, and most of the images which are produced today are not even seen by someone. They are going directly into a kind of vacuum, I would say. Humanity produces more than 3 billion images, a day. It's absolutely immense, and who looks at them? Almost nobody. It's interesting to consider that as history of art tells us exactly the opposite. There was always less images than people who see them, and now we have more and more images at such a point that we don't have even time to look at them. Anthropology, in a way, has been spread out within society. We are actually, through our smartphones, giving information about ourselves, which is exactly what Lévi-Strauss was doing when he was visiting the Amazonians in the 1930s. This idea of the image as bringing something from the far away has totally gone. It's totally disappeared. And here we have a new civilization of the image, which is actually installing itself under our eyes. Aby Warburg had a very interesting conception of the artwork as a signal, actually. Signals need fuel. The signals needs energy to circulate. There's no signal without energy. If you want to send a signal, whatever it is, even if you write something with a pen, you need the energy of the human hand to propel it. If you want to send a signal that would go further than that, you always need energy. And artworks are actually the signals that were fueled with energy enough to sustain themselves in time. If we look at work by Vermeer or Mondrian or whoever in a museum, it's because they, as artists, have gathered mental energy around it, within the work, so it sustains itself, in a certain way. And that's, for me, the equivalent of what the ancients called beauty. Just called beauty because there was no other words. But it's not only about beauty in a visual way of the word. it's also information. It's also the capacity to address complexity. It's lots of different factors which allow an artwork to sustain in time. But maybe it's a parenthesis in my speech today. What's interesting is that this question of distance we're still in this idea of promiscuity. No, this idea of the distance as something which has become more and more rare, more and more difficult to find, was also at the core of the definition of the aura by Walter Benjamin, for example. The aura was defined by Walter Benjamin as the unique apparition of a faraway. And what's this faraway element which appears for one time is exactly what is very difficult to find today, actually. No, because there's no distance anymore. Distances have been folded by technologies, folded by our way of living, folded again by the fact that the planet has become totally complete as an entity. The aura that Walter Benjamin describes has, in a way, completely disappeared too. And we have to reinvent a new set of elements to understand our own artistic production today. Because the artwork's specific character, and that's interesting that Walter Benjamin talked about it at the moment he was actually writing about the mechanical reproducibility. It lies in a distance, and it also lies in the strength of an apparition, actually. Apparition. An artist like Barnett Newman took this expression also for himself, when, especially in the text that he wrote called "The Sublime is Now." Sublime is an interesting category, by the way, and it's interesting because it corresponds to our new experience of the world. We are immersed into reality. We are not facing a reality. So the sublime, in a way, might be the new notion that might pop up in the next years, according to me, because it's about immersion. It's about being within something. And Barnett Newman was actually one of the artists in the 20th century that really tried to find a new definition of the sublime. The second aspect of this aesthetics of the Capitalocene is, but it's totally depending on the first one, what I call the crisis of the human scale, actually. It seems that the human beings have more and more problems positioning themselves within the societies they created themselves. Think about the fact that today, in the US only, more than 80% of the stock market operations are made by machines. In 2013, 2013 was the year when there were more machines than human beings on the internet. Actually, within the chat box and the algorithmic, processes are more. There are more mechanical, technical inhabitants in the internet than human beings, and this is something that actually should question us about our presence in this world. Where are we, actually? It could be a good question. Where are we as we actually invented the processes which actually replace us everywhere? So it's a very interesting figure in a way. But there is, when I talk about the crisis of the human scale, it's also the way humans represent themselves. what is absolutely certain today for me is that it's not possible to represent the world as in the way which is the classical way since at least 2000 years in the Western world, which is human beings distinctly cut out from the natural environment, let's say. This idea of figure on something which is totally distinct from it. This goes with this idea that the human species was actually distinct from the world. It's something you can find obviously in the Bible. It's something you can find also in Aristotle's theories of art also. But that's what the monotheist religious text teaches us. You know, first says that they say that humans were created in God's image, and God is unavoidably of the masculine gender, by the way, which is important to notice. And nature is nothing more than a scenery into these narratives. And it's a theater, in a way, where mankind is, the task of mankind is to arrange it and exactly as they want. Actually, it doesn't matter. That's this idea of a figure upon a background, since the portraits of the Fayum, for example, has been our everyday. It seems that totally normal. You have to see human beings, you know, in what kind of green space behind them, or an environment, actually, as if, you know, the word environment is very problematic, actually, to be honest. I don't think we're living in an environment. We could talk about a milieu, yeah, in a biological meaning of the term, but certainly not an environment. You know, nature is not something that surrounds us as if we're not part of it. And this representation, this mode of representation, is the dominant one, obviously. That's one of the reasons, for example, why the Impressionist paintings were scandalous in the 19th century, because the Impressionist painters represented human bodies exactly the same way than objects, you know, next to them. There was no difference of nature between humans and the decor they were into. And that was the main scandal of provoked by Impressionist painting, something that was actually caused a huge commotion, the same way than Copernic theories or Galileo. It's very important to see that the representations are never innocent. They are just carrying an ideology behind them. And this ideology is today in crisis. And we see it very clearly in contemporary art. So this idea of the mankind as the Bible says, master and owner of nature, is obviously overturned by the awareness, which is summarized by the term of Anthropocene or Capitalocene. Even more deeply, if you go even further in time, there is one pillar of the Western aesthetics which has been developed by Aristotle in the 6th century before Christ, which is this idea that every artistic gesture, and hence, you know, in a way, it was a more global conception of the world, every artistic gesture was the result of one figure, which was the apposition of a form over matter. That's in Aristotle. That's the pillar of his aesthetics. Il est, the matter, and morphe, the form. So morphe, engraving, ile. That's really important to see that we actually are so used to this way of thinking that we don't notice it even. Joseph Beuys defines culture exactly the same way. By the way, he was talking about printing. Actually, printing is exactly this idea. You have an active principle and a passive one. That's the core for me of the Western ideology and the way it generated all kinds of oppression over the centuries. Because this ile and morphe structure of mind, it actually declines in several binary oppositions. It's man, woman, active, passive, nature, culture, civilized, savage, etc., etc. This binary system, which is at the core of the Western thought, is the matrix of all segregations, according to me. And it's important to follow the thread of this binary system into history. What is interesting today, actually, I'm going a bit faster because otherwise I really can, this idea is very important, maybe we can talk about it later, is to see that there is a new generation of artists. I tried to show some of them in the exhibition Crash Test that I curated in 2018, for whom, and I think that's really the generation of artists that appeared in the 2010s, really artists were marked by the idea of the Anthropocene already, who make no difference. They don't split their way of thinking into ile and morphe, between form on one side and matter on the other side. There's not an active principle coming into an inert matter. For them, everything is material, and there's no inert or secondary background. And that's really important to understand. Because the depiction of anything as a background, for me, it's the negation of the very event of the Anthropocene. Because it translates into spaces where no hierarchies remain between the different realms and between the different states of matter. And that's, according to me, the core of the Anthropocene awareness. No differences between different states of matter, no differences between human and non-human, subject and object. And this system of oppositions is precisely what is put into question in the work. Because, and you can not only see this, what I call this molecular representations of the world. It comes also from what I call promiscuity before, because we see that we are more and more living in a mental landscape where the vegetal, the machinic, the animal, the mineral, the molecular, and the social seem to be completely, tied up together, actually. That's this promiscuity I was talking about. We, as human beings, don't have a privileged position anymore. We don't have a specific scale, neither. We are caught within the microscopic, which has become the real agent of history. What is the agent of history today? Glyphosate, viruses, tear gas for demonstrations. We can name hundreds of things. This level of microscopic realities is part of our lives, much more than intermediary beings. And then we have the immensities, the global change, the climate change, sorry, the the sea level, the atmosphere itself. You see, microscopic on one side and the immense, the huge on the other side. That's why I see today, and that's very visible in today's representations, this crisis of the human scale. Maybe another element linked to, because I don't want to be too long, another element which is also a common point between anthropology and art. In the 19th century, there was a German biologist, Jakob von Uexküll, who called the Umwelt the sensorial environment which is specific to a species or an individual in a species. It's the Umwelt is the own world of an animal, determined by what it can perceive, what it can do, based on its mental and physical characteristics in a given environment, of course. So we all have an Umwelt. We all are limited by our mental and physical characteristics, which actually determine what we can see. And that's a very interesting common point between art and anthropology. The Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro says all beings represent the world in the same way. What changes is the world that they see. And you see easily how this sentence can be applied to art, of course. The difference between subjects is first the specificity of their organism, what they're capable of seeing and feeling, obviously. So each one forms a kind of idiosyncrasy, a singular and unique physical and nervous disposition. And that's I think, a very interesting common point between anthropology and art, because actually remember that in the history, the quality of subject, not everyone was a subject. Even human beings used to be objects. Actually, when you're a slave, you're an object, for example. It was restricted to a certain kind of human being. Because there are specific xenophobias, actually. Xenos mean the other. Xenophobia is absolutely, everywhere, and not only in the banal, sadly banal sense of the word, because it consists in denying any being that's different from yourself the ability to perceive, because it perceives, he or she perceives differently, actually. So being, and that's a common lesson that we can take from art and anthropology, being is framing the world in a certain way. And this frame is actually what we actually talk about when we talk about art. Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, again, I quote, "The world is composed of a multiplicity of points of view, an infinity of perspectives." And he actually recuperates the concept of perspectivism from the Amazonian populations themselves, actually. Eduardo Viveiros de Castro is an anthropologist who actually was taught by the people he was actually supposed to observe according to the Western standards of science. It's very important to understand this also, because it's also linked with relational aesthetics in a way. Tim Ingold, the British anthropologist, defines anthropology like philosophy with the people in. which I really love. Actually, it's a beautiful definition of anthropology, I think. And it's also a beautiful definition of art, frankly. And to end up with Eduardo Viveros de Castro, a sentence that sums it up, I think, is the fact that, as he stated, anthropology is, I quote, the theory and practice of permanent decolonization. And of course, it's also the decolonization of ourselves, you know, of the way we also can be colonizing the world. I was wondering if I was a bit too long. Otherwise, I can stop here. No, and we can actually go to the Q&A.
It depends on you. We can stop for intermediate questions, or we can continue. It depends on you.
Well, I can, you know, I never know. I can talk for 1 more hour, or or maybe we can pass the questions.
Right. Well, we still have a half an hour, so I was just wondering if there would be any questions. Right, and I see one question coming up from the student from Ugnius. And the question goes like this: could you please elaborate on the myth of progress?
Yeah.
What is the alternative myth we should live by?
Very interesting question. Maybe first let's talk about the notion of myth, actually. One of the authors I'm really discussing in my next book called Inclusions is Claude Lévi-Strauss, who I think is an absolutely crucial writer, thinker for today, for many reasons. First, he was one of the first ones to disconnect this kind of couple, this binary opposition between nature and culture from '62, actually already. He just said it was exactly a myth that was invented by the Western civilization in order to justify and to feed the notion of progress. Because what is progress? It's the way it is intended in the Western world is technical progress. It cannot exist, actually, if we don't define who's the savage. So the savage were the primitives, let's say, were the first, were the objects of the first anthropology at the end of 19th century. Someone like Fraser, for example, who wrote, I forgot the title in English, but one of the first important book of anthropology, was a blatant racist, actually. He was absolutely justifying the domination of the world by the Western people in the name of progress. Because we have to understand something which is fascinating. It's that for the first anthropologists, not till the middle of the 20th century, they were not considering the people they were talking to as their contemporaries. You know, they were primitives. They were coming from prehistory, from the past of the anthropologist. You know, the anthropologist was the present, and the Ashwar or the Bourriaud for Lévi-Strauss were the past, were the primitives, and one day they would actually access to the same values and the same kind of civilization than us. Us, between brackets, being the Western, and that's a justification of colonization and the standardization of the world, actually, also. So that's a myth, yeah. If there was this division between nature and culture had not existed, Western culture would not have been able to dominate the world, technically speaking, because in order to develop in a very exponential way the technology that was used to dominate the world, first you had to invent the experimental apparatus. And it's only possible if you think of nature as something you can divide and almost torture in a way, cut in pieces. Then you are inventing the experiment. In the 16th century, the Chinese and the Europeans were quite close, technologically speaking. But the Chinese thought is based on the idea of nature as a partner, as a flux that you actually can almost marry. That's the term "shun" in Chinese. And on the other hand, it's at the same period, more or less, you have an important philosopher, British philosopher named Francis Bacon, like the painter, who actually justifies the experimental devices or the extraction of the minerals, for example, as rape, literally rape. He compares nature to a prostitute and says that she has to be actually almost beaten up and mastered. So it's very violent. And this violence is absolutely inseparable from the myth of progress as we know it in Europe. And yeah, it is a violent myth. It's a myth of conquest. It's a myth of domination. And just read a few texts by Francis Bacon. It's horrifying, no, literally.
Okay, thank you very much. I also have a couple questions coming from the audience watching us on the Facebook. And first comes from Virginia Vitkienė, who is the CEO of, yes, Kaunas 2022. And Virginia thanks you for the lecture. And she says, I really admire your curatorial approach. You observe carefully what artists are reflecting in their work, what are they focusing on, and then theorizing processes and make exhibitions simultaneously. Are you working now on some new exhibition biennial based on your new book, which will come out in 2021?
Well, I try to alternate, well, not alternate, not really. I always say actually that when I have questions, I do an exhibition. When I have a few answers, I write a book. You know, that's more or less my method. So I just finished the book actually, you know, during the first confinement in spring. So it's gonna be published next week in Italian, and then in Spanish, then in French and English in March. So I'm just trying to digest all this. But for the moment, I don't have a new project for a group show or something like that. You know, I had a very dense year 2019 with the Istanbul Biennial, but several big exhibitions in Montpellier also. And I was obliged to rest in 2020, as more or less every one of us, you know, or at least be less active. So it just took this time to try to develop new concepts actually, this book was the result of this, really literally the product of this year, you know, because I had suddenly much more time to write. So next year I go back to talking with artists, visiting studios, because I miss it very much, and I need to see exhibitions. You know, it's just terrible. I have the impression I didn't see an exhibition for months.
Right. Thank you very much. Another question is coming from Dovilė Tumpytė. And she asks, could you provide with an example of at least one art piece that corresponds with your idea about a new generation of artists from 2010 that do not think in binary oppositions anymore? Yeah. Curious about what art practice you have in mind.
Well, maybe I can quote two totally different artists, if you agree. One is a painter, and the other one is well, actually, let's say first one is Dora Budor, for example. She's I think Croatian, but she lives in New York. I invited her to the Istanbul Biennial, and she produced a very interesting series of works, which were mainly at the shape of a kind of aquarium. But into this aquarium, you have very specific kind of dimmed light, like a fog, literally. And you could see at the bottom of this aquarium some dust, you know, getting up. And it was actually activated by the construction sites around the exhibition space. You know, so every time there was a new action at the construction space, it was actually producing the dust into the aquarium. So you had three different ones linked to different places. And she related this work to William Turner, who actually was the first painter at the beginning of the 19th century in England to capture the industrial fog, actually. So we had this amazing, you know, very dimmy light within the aquariums, which created a very specific and strange atmosphere. She also works with molecules like oxytocin, who alters the human brain, with dust, which is created for movies, for example. It's always microscopic elements which are actually creating, building images at some point. Well, that's one example. Huh? I could quote also, because it's less expected, a painter whom I find very extraordinary at the moment, Ambera Wellman. Ambera Wellman is literally inventing a new pictorial space where it's absolutely impossible to, where the bodies, organisms, I would say, are completely rearticulated. It's as if the gaze was actually within the painting itself, and drawn according to very specific ideas of eroticism also. So it's a very interesting painter. She's a Canadian born artist. I could quote also Tala Madani, if you want another painter, for example, because Tala Madani was born in Iran, represents a kind of totalitarian nightmare whose main protagonists are middle-aged, you know, Oriental males, and it's a world where the human being, here again, has lost absolutely all his or her properties. It's like inflatable characters. There's a kind of there's no distance anymore between the surroundings and the figures. So all those elements, all those events happening in representation actually are interesting me a lot. But of course, I could quote Pierre Huyghe, but it would be more expected, I guess. So I prefer to talk about less known artists here.
Right. Although names such as Thomas Saraceno or
sure,
Philippe Renaud comes to mind.
Thomas Saraceno is in the cover of the Italian edition of the book, by the way.
Right.
So you guess well.
That's interesting. Right. I have.
He's working with spiders. He's working with wavelength, with carbon dioxide, etc., etc. So yeah, it's obviously this way to take the molecular dimension of life into account, which is, according to me, the most important aesthetic event today.
Right. I have another question coming from Miriam Dade. She thanks you so much for the lecture. And she says, I've been an avid follower of your work for a decade now, very influential on my thinking. We hope to see you in Kaunas soon. Question, what is your opinion on the current choices that large and generally closed down cultural institutions have to make between firing their low-paid service workers as opposed to selling bits of their vast art coffers?
You mean after the sanitary crisis?
I believe so, yes.
Yeah, sure. Well, I can tell you what happens here, because I'm running a place where we have 72 people working. No one has been fired. No, and not even the ones who actually really could not work because they are just working at the desk, for example, etc. There are always ways to keep people in. If you're not obsessed just by rentability, obviously. But I guess it's easier for me because I'm working on public money, obviously. When in America, for example, I see it's a slaughter, actually, what's going on at the moment. You see hundreds of people fired, from one day to another. It's a very serious crisis that we're facing. And it's not going to get any better, I'm afraid, in the next year. It's very serious. And I think, yeah, why not selling an artwork? Yeah. It's certainly a better solution, but yeah, it's always complicated. To some museums in France, for example, you cannot do that. No, it's absolutely impossible. It's called, how is it called? Alienability of the collection. So we once something gets into the collection, you cannot sell it or give it away.
Right. Okay, I have a question myself, and since your lecture, which was truly thought-provoking, is within the framework of a regular course called Social Discourse in Visual Arts, I do appreciate your perspective on Anthropocene or the capitalist scene, and it provides a very important addition, because so far we were discussing art as, to use your own terms, a way of making new relations between the humans. However, from what you said, we need to apply a broader perspective to include the nature, environment, and everything what surrounds us and shares our own space with us into the equation, in order to understand that those relationships are not necessarily only meant for humans, but the relationships could also include the inanimate, if you will, objects that surrounds us.
Absolutely. If I could sum up relational aesthetics in one sentence, this sentence would actually match this idea. I would say that what is art? It's a state of encounter, actually. And if there was one mathematical formula that could actually qualify art, I would say it's this very enigmatic number, which is the omega number. I don't know if you know what it is. I'm not so fond of mathematics, but this one is very interesting. The omega number is the sum of all numbers plus one, actually. And this plus one added to the existing, actually, defines perfectly well what the artwork is, actually. Because we are not, art is a state of encounter, and we actually meet suddenly this new, very strange being that an artwork can be, and we're not expecting it. Because if we expect it, it's not that good, right? If you expect an artwork, you know, to be what it is, I think it's a definition of a bad artwork. So there's always an element of surprise, and fortunately, so that this +1 that is implied in the number omega. So it means that we are actually we have to take into account this contingency. We live in a contingent world, you know, surrounded by random and chance, actually, and we don't know what we are going to meet. There are two extremes, and that my book starts like this, actually, because there are two extremes in the human chain. One is the artwork, and it's absolute luxury because it's useless. Huh? That's the idea. And the other extreme is waste. So you have rubbish on one side and the luxurious object that the artwork is on the other side. And these are the two works which are not the two things in our world, which are not in their place, actually. We can define dirt or pollution, and the very interesting anthropologist Mary Douglas does it. You know, she defines pollution or dirt as what it's not in its place. We just see it. We can actually qualify it as dirt or pollution because it's not at its place. But if you think just a little bit, the artwork is exactly this. When Marcel Duchamp shows a butter rack in a gallery in the 1910s, it's just displacing something, and it's not at its place. It's art is about this in a way. When Magritte, you know, you see Magritte painting or Max Ernst painting or Piero della Francesca painting, even, you know, it's about things which are not at the right place, where they're supposed to be. So there's a negative quality, which is pollution or dirt, and a positive quality of disorder, which is the artwork. I think that that's the anthropologically speaking, that's the way I see it.
Right, and that's a quite new perspective in terms of quite recent developments. A couple lectures ago, the group were discussing such artists as Rikrit Tiravanya. And in these instances that were coming from 10 years or so ago, we saw this very clear-cut urge to connect people with our people, to make those human contacts. And all of a sudden, after one decade or so, we see that these horizons are somewhat expanding, and we are not anthropocentric anymore. Is that right? Yeah,
I think that's the explanation and the summing up of my evolution in those last 15 years. Actually, we had to integrate the non-human into our ways of thinking and seeing the world. And most of the artists, look at Pierre Wig, actually, you know, it's very interesting to see that he was one of the artists I discussed in relational aesthetics. And now he's working with bees and bacteria, viruses, cells. We all followed the same evolution in a way. You know, it's in the zeitgeist, you know, it's in the spirits of the time. And there's no way we can escape from it. You know, we have to face this because it's the evolution goes towards this inclusion that I'm mentioning in the book. We have to develop an inclusive thought. And inclusive means integrating, all the other emissions that exist in the world, not only the human art, not only the human voice, but organizing this polyphony of voices. And here artists are actually working like translators in a way. There are many of those who actually work with minerals or with plants or with animals or with machines. It's all about translating. How can we make those elements, how can we consider those emissions within the human language? And how can it be meaningful and signifying for us? That's what we see now more and more in exhibitions.
Right. Let me check. Do we have any more questions coming from the audience? Not yet. I'm addressing students now. Would you have any questions? Don't be shy. Go ahead. Take this advantage.
I don't see you anyway. So.
Right. Unfortunately, we cannot afford to have cameras on due to the connection matters. So go ahead. Don't be shy. Ask questions in the chat box. Meanwhile, I have a very occasional question since...
Just one thing before. I'm totally stupid. I should have talked about the parodų hardware, who actually were in the Istanbul Biennial, who are from Lithuania, as you know, who are really working on this this matter. They recently, in a show that we organized here in Montpellier last January called Permafrost, just a follow-up of the Istanbul Biennial. Parodų hardware were a couple. I've been working on the current experiments made on octopus's cells, actually, that are supposed to prevent against aging. And they actually are very interesting artists in terms, formally speaking, also, because they're really inventing a kind of grammar of the living, which is very strong.
Excuse me, were you referring to Urbani family or?
Yeah, parodų hardware. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Right. The famous capital is really well known in Lithuania. Right. Okay. Don't see any questions. So I have another one from myself. Since one of the most famous lines in your book is about the unclogging art as a possibility to unclog communicative channels between people or groups of the people, what would be your take on the current situation when the COVID-19 pandemic actually closed all international and internal traveling? Does the art, as you see it, still unclogs the communicative channels? Does it adapt to the changing of the situation, or it takes a pause for a while?
I think that the current crisis will make us value even more, the fact of going to a physical place and meeting people, and so there might be a kind of very strong revival of this at the moment, very soon. TV had been invented actually in a way to stuck people into their places. It's like looking at the chimney, more or less. The people had a kind of tap with images coming in their homes from the 1950s, and it was a way to maintain them in their homes. Today we have progressed a lot into keeping people in their homes. It seems that there's a new technology of confinement which is operating, and it's not about conspiracy. It's just a kind of I think. That's unconscious drive, crossing humanity at the moment, crossing the power, actually, because the situation where people are actually staying at home and buying things on internet might be the dream situation for the power. Bill Gates was confessed one day that he was actually he dreamt about capitalism without friction, situation. No, it's very interesting because this idea of a very smooth social surface where there would be no obstacles, nothing that's not too spiky, something that would be absolutely calm. That's exactly the situation of the confinement. We are all at home and we are in front of screens, and you know, it's the capitalism without friction that Bill Gates dreamt about. Well, let's get out of it.
Right, that's very interesting. That's a very interesting proposition, very interesting thought. Right, any more questions? Go ahead. Let me see. No, yeah, I'm getting another question from Dovile, who asks, do you see some tendencies in art practices that are changing the art form in aesthetic sense itself still in the 21st century, not only elaborating new discourses?
If I understood well, I think I tried in a way to answer this question during the whole lecture. For me, what's the new forms actually are, well, it's difficult to invent a form anyway. It's a very slow process, and it comes from social changes. It comes from evolution of mentalities and new ways of seeing the world. So it's a civilizational mutation that provokes new forms, and I think we are actually living it now. I think those artists who are actually apprehending reality from its molecular dimension are inventing new forms. For me, that's the driving force at the moment in action in art, both in representation and in the way artists use materials now.
Right, thank you. I have another question coming from our student. You talked a lot about interdisciplinarity of art. What about relational art and art therapy? Do they fit together?
Yeah, obviously. But anyway, therapy is relational in its sense. No, it's generally it's a dialogue. It's something which goes with at least two people. So yeah, there's another way you can see that question is relinking art and healing, or the practices of the witches of the 15th, 16th, 17th century, for example, the alchemists also. Art today occupies the space that was occupied in ancient times by healers or magic, or and people who were actually marginalized by capitalism. Michel Foucault described it very well in the History of Madness. Silvia Federici talked about it the same way, but from a feminist perspective. It's really important to understand that art has come to occupy the space that was devoted to magic in ancient societies, and the place which is occupied by shaman in so-called primitive societies today. It's very close, very, very close. If you really look seriously about the role of the shaman in traditional societies, it's pretty close to what the artist does in ours. The only thing is that there's a discourse in their societies that legitimates and justifies the shaman, and in our societies there's a discourse that legitimates and justifies the artist. We can understand what an artist does because there is a discourse around it, because we have provided the tools to understand what these strange people do actually. That guy who just does a painting which is white on white, Malevich. Another one who actually hangs a banana on a wall, Catalan, etc., etc. in any society that would be deprived of artistic discourse, it would lead those artists into the madhouse directly, because there will be no way to understand what they're doing. We understand it because that is the space that we devote to irrational thinking, to the questioning of society, to the critical analysis of our societies. And this is more or less the role that is given to the shaman in a traditional society. So, yeah, that's not exactly therapy, but that's healing.
Thank you very much. I have two questions coming from the audience. First by Kristina Jakubauskaitė. Thank you for the lecture. My question is, how would you comment the thought that trying to connect people in the galleries, trying to recreate natural human relations in the artificial act itself? Thank you.
Because does it really matter that it happens in nature or in culture? Because the idea is precisely to bypass this opposition. So if there is such an event or such an exhibition in an artificial surrounding, it's more or less exactly the same than if it was in the forest. I think the most important thing is to really move from this binary opposition. I think there is no nature. I don't see that. There's no culture either. There is just the world. And why are we making such a difference? Because before of the tradition of our societies, because that's the way we are taught we should think. But for example, most of the people who talk about the Amazonian forest have no idea that it's not natural. The Amazonian forest has been sculpted by the Amazonians for thousands of years. No, it's a completely, it looks like a mess, so the Europeans just saw the white. But this mess is super well organized, you know, and most of the Amazonian tribes know exactly that they should plant these 3 seeds next to each other because they help each other to grow, etc., etc. There's no wilderness in the Amazonas. It's a construction, a human construction at least half of it, and I think the landscape is also, whatever landscape actually, is both human and natural, because there's no place now where human didn't go. The world is a construction, even the so-called natural part of it. And to say that there is a nature that would be separated from us is a way to take no responsibility for what's going on. And I think if we want to take responsibility for the planet, we have to acknowledge the fact that there is no nature and no culture.
Okay, I have another question coming from Paulius Yevsejevas. Following the metaphor of contemporary art as translation, what would be the source text?
I don't know. Maybe it's a bit pretentious, but I wrote about it actually. I'm sorry to quote myself here, but nothing else comes to my mind. In the book called Radicant, I'm trying to use the metaphor of translation as a very operative, method for artists. So that's the only thing that comes to my mind at the moment. I'm sorry. I should be a bit more generous, but nothing to remember. I don't remember any. There's, of course, the text by Walter Benjamin, the task of the translator. Yeah, Walter Benjamin.
Okay, so I guess we still have time for one and the last question. So who will take this opportunity? I don't see any raised hands, and I'm not getting any questions. So I guess this is the time to say thank you for such a thought-provoking and indeed a very deep lecture. I see the thanks are coming from the students as well, which really appreciate your time and your impact to our course, broadening our perspectives, and well, we just can't wait for your new book to come out of the print. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all, and I hope I'll be in Kaunas for the next biennial very soon.
Well, hopefully so. We do hope to meet you next year in person. Thank you again, Nicolas Bourriaud. It was a great pleasure having you here at Faculty of Communication, Vilnius University.
Thank you all. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.